see a red light. Okay, we're live. This is Journeys in Podcasting. This will be an evening edition. Tonight we'll be talking to John Zola. He's in Colorado. And we're going to be talking about Socratic circles, and we'll steer the conversation tonight not just towards the methods of a Socratic circle, the check-ins, the checkouts, the process, but we'll talk about Socratic circles as part of a Socratic learning system. Hi, John. How are you? And maybe you want to refresh the audience. Who are you? Where do you come from?
I will. Hi, Chris, and everybody, if there's anybody out there. I spent my career as a teacher, middle school, high school social studies. I helped to create a non-traditional sort of break the mold high school in Boulder, Colorado. Taught there for 15, 16 years. And in the last 8 or 9, have continued to do workshops and things like that. And I experienced Socratic Seminars, which is what I call them, in the late 1980s, and they became a central part of both my practice as well as the school that I taught at, and helped to create, along with my wife and a bunch of other colleagues, and now continue to do these workshops both locally and abroad. So, and Chris and I have had some background conversations about this, and I like talking about talking.
Excellent. Well, what you've been talking about and what you present on, I feel like it is coming full circle, or at least I hope it is becoming more popular in education. I see it appearing all over the place, this idea of a learning system. And I like this idea of the Socratic Seminars, Socratic circles, as creating this event to work towards, but also creating a kind of space to practice what you want to develop into a Socratic system within your class. I'm going to show you really quickly here a reading that I pulled up recently. Can you see that screen there?
I can.
Okay, well, this is my series of questions, but
right.
I looked at other readings of who else was writing about these Socratic circles. So from the document, if anyone is visiting our document here, how this works is there are a list of readings here, and then there's a list of inquiry, and inquiries all have titles there as well. And so one of them was this one, which was the Socratic Seminars. I'm just going to click through here so if anyone wants to know how that document works. And here it is. And so this is Mary Davenport, who I thought gave a great rundown. Not if you go to John's site, he gives all kind of PDFs and methods and check-in samples. But you just want a rundown of like what is the Socratic Seminar and how can we use it. This provided a great resource for that. So what I'd like to do is just kind of throw some questions at you, kind of based off of that article. So let's start with one. And
actually, before you go into the article, let me just sort of go back to just give, for me, a framework that this sort of systemic thinking and stuff. The simple way for me of thinking about that is that our school's about creating individuals and citizens who believe that they can think and should think, and that thinking is an important thing, or are we involved in this for some other purpose, wittingly or unwittingly? And so that systemic thing that you're talking about, it's really about to what extent do we expect kids to think, because we expect citizens to think, and we expect spouses to think, and we expect significant others to think, we expect our friends to think. And so I guess I just want to even simplify more this notion of what's the systemic thing we want. The systemic thing we want is the ability to think and to express your thoughts thoughtfully, and to be able to hear other people's thoughts, and then to interact around each other's thinking. And that's, to me, that's the system we're trying to create. And if we don't provide opportunities for that to happen in a variety of ways in our classrooms, then all we're doing is preparing kids to fill out worksheets, and nobody fills out worksheets in life. And so that, to me, just as you were talking about the systemic stuff, that's where my thinking goes at that point. So
yeah, as we go through, we're going to come to another section which we'll call epistemological assumptions.
Right.
That is that if you are practicing Socratic circles, there are assumptions about learning, about what knowledge is.
That's right.
That would kind of have to be in place. So let's go through, and then in this discussion, we can also talk about how, where this appears in our standards. Common Core is very limited. I feel like where you get into creativity, innovation, critical thinking. There's some in the reading and writing. There's a couple of standards there, but mainly it comes out in the speaking and listening. Right. And so I think that's kind of a shame, because that means that they're ignoring this whole, reading as a social dynamic, writing as a social process,
Right.
as opposed to just like a series of mechanics that you're going to walk through. So let's start this by kind of saying that, this is a Socratic system we'll be talking about, kind of like what you want to bracket learning with. And we'll talk about risk and trust. And so from the article, she says, there's no Socratic seminar without risk, and there's no risk without trust. Well, already that's going to offend a lot of teachers because there are risk-averse teachers. An effective Socratic seminar occurs because of the thousands of invisible connections already built among students and teachers. So that's getting at that system thing. So what I wanted to get at was how Socratic Circles is merely an event and with its limitations, something to work towards. But in some ways, the episode that should reflect something much harder to construct, this continuous Socratic system of planning. Is that the way you see it? As far as like planning this event, how it's going to spread into a system within the class?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that if in fact a Socratic seminar as an event is an opportunity where kids believe that they're empowered to make meanings and that they're not trying to parse out what the teacher wants is the right answer, but rather they're struggling with a rich text in some way to figure out what sense do we make of this. And that's an event. That event can really only happen in a classroom climate where students believe that they have voice and where there's a community of learners that is, again, based upon trust. And that relates to the risk-taking. And risk-taking, I kind of think both in classrooms and in seminars, there's two kinds of risk-taking. There's behavioral risk-taking and there's intellectual risk-taking. The behavioral risk-taking is the overly talkative kid taking the risk of shutting up every now and again and providing space for other kids to speak. It's the quiet kid who has ideas and finds ways with each other's, with students' help, as their peers' help, as well as with the teachers' help, to get their voice into the seminar. So that behavioral risk, I think, is really important. And that's part of the way that you build trust in a classroom, is that students recognize that their conversational style has an impact on other kids' conversational styles and their access to this space that we call the conversation. There's then the intellectual risk, which I think is what we more commonly think of, and that's the risk-taking that comes from saying, I believe we're talking about this as an interpretation, but I think this might be an alternative interpretation of some sort. And so I think both of those forms of risk both take place in seminars, but seminars are also a place to nurture the sorts of communities. So it's an iterative process. You create a classroom climate through seminars, and seminars reflect the classroom climate and reinforce that community. And so it goes kind of around and around, hopefully in a virtuous cycle where it becomes easier and easier to have those conversations, whether it's in the specific event of a seminar or if it's in the more casual conversations that take place kind of all the time in an interactive classroom.
So I'm hearing a couple of things. One is this space for the democratization of voice. And in this competition of the classroom airways, and anyone who's been a teacher knows this, that it can very easily become this constant rapid fire dialogue between teacher and those 2 or 3 go-getter students who are just super verbal. And I feel like this is where a lot of the work towards the Socratic Circle and our digital medias could come into play, where you have social construction off of each other, the students critiquing each other on the way to the circle, so that that student who may have a really hard time expressing themselves verbally on the, in the circle themselves, however, their work is already out there and the kids are very, they can reference it, they can bring it into conversation, so that, it's not just a matter of speak on point, but it's already evident to these other students that this student has done the work and prepared on the way there as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think this will be a tension that'll go throughout this conversation, and probably lots of conversations, is to what extent are we trying to help kids sort of make meaning and engage in these behaviors in real face-to-face time, on the one hand, and what sorts of opportunities support the doing of those things in real time in preparation for the seminar. And I think part of the power of a seminar is kids realizing that we come together for an event where we know that we're all going to have voice. Not everybody has to participate every seminar. Not every kid has to participate equally in every seminar, But we know that as we look at seminars over the arc of a term, of a semester or a year, that everybody will have opportunities to have that voice, and that the meaning-making skills that we develop are those that sort of exist in real time. Because a lot of, and I have this tension, a lot of what we do in life is preparing for things. So we think about things in advance. That's important. But a lot of it is also figuring out what we think we know in real time. So as we watch the presidential debates, we're making meaning in real time. And if we're having a conversation with each other about that, we want to practice those sorts of skills. As we're having conversations in a book group with each other, there's this interplay of thoughts I had before, but am I open to the ideas that are being expressed here? So again, I have this tension. I think it's a positive tension, but I don't want to overly front load activities, but I don't want to ignore the front loading so that kids aren't prepared to have the rich conversation that I want, if that makes sense.
It totally does. I think we referred to this in our last talk about this idea of the farmer and the hunter. That the farmer is going to really excel in this procedural, well thought process of construction of knowledge, where the hunter is going to be very good, I think, at what you're talking about, of quick use of their heuristics, of their problem solving, of thinking in the moment, of constructing from what these 3 or 4 people said, and going on from there. And like I said, I came into this more through the lens of junior 8 book series and leading those symposiums and learning from the kids, literally watching their trajectory from the first symposium of the year to the last symposium of the year, and watching that model of how they learn to feed off of each other. And a lot of that came from our reflections of the videos that we would record of the circles. Then we would take clips of those videos and show off cool thinking moves that they demonstrated live time during the act. And so I can refer to a couple. One is from an ESL student who was not the hunter, very methodical. She's a polyglot. So when she did produce language, it was a very slow thought out process. She was sort of caught between all the languages and very methodical in how she would come up with her own oral production. And yet they got on such an emotional theme of someone said something that was sort of an affront against women and what their capabilities were of this character in the story. And she literally went off on the circle and literally attacked everyone's argument, worked them backwards and forwards. It was quite amazing. So I think that's an example of what we're talking about, of putting them into that environment, into that episodic session where they're able to access those skills and maybe discover them. And then if we're recording them, we can go back and replay that and validate it and discuss,
And I actually never recorded seminars, but one of the procedures that is integral to seminars in my practice is when the seminar is over, I say, it's time for us to stop the seminar. We've got bells, things like that. I always do so and make sure that there's time to do what sort of has come to be called the critique. And it's an opportunity where we stop, we're done talking about the text, but I start with one kid and everybody goes around. And the prompt is, what's something that you noticed about our conversation? And the beginning of the year, the kids are pretty cryptic. They're not very insightful. But as they do it after every seminar, they get more and more, and again, it's the trust and the risk-taking, they get more and more willing to talk about. Some people talk too much. Not enough people participated. It felt like people were attacking people rather than ideas. And it's out of that critique process that we build the culture of the conversation that we have. And it's out of that I ask the class, so what do we need to do next seminar to fix what didn't work this time? Or what do we want to improve on and focus on next seminar? And we build our culture together. And so I agree with you that reflection is really, really important, even if it doesn't take the form of a documentary thing, but that the kids are always not only doing the process, they're reflecting on the nature of the process that they're engaged in.
So let's move on to another topic, because I think we could stay on this one all night. But the other one is something we did talk about last time, and this is something that I struggle with, and it's this idea of the anchor charts and the program language of sentence starters, of ways to get kids thinking down a routine. I definitely have applied the Project Zero thinking routines. I think those are great for getting kids to kind of enter with some form of thinking that we can all work with together. But in the article, she talks about anchor charts to teach, model, reinforce target vocabulary, and to establish a way for students to recognize each other's academic vocabulary use. And of course, if you're on a topic, social studies, science, mathematics in particular, and there's particular language that's embedded in the concepts that you're trying to get at, you can totally see how you want to track the vocabulary and teach how to enter with that vocabulary, teach different critical thinking moves with sentence starters. How critical do you think this is to teach all of these things going into the circle?
See, it's a great question, because it really gets at what the nature, for me, of what a Socratic seminar is. And a Socratic seminar is teaching. The value for me of a Socratic seminar is that what you're doing is teaching a process. You're not teaching content, you're teaching a process. Now that process is embedded in your curriculum. So if I'm doing a Socratic seminar in a Civil War unit and I'm using Lincoln's second inaugural address, I'm expecting that they're going to use language and concepts related to the Civil War and to social studies, to the language of history. But I don't know what language they're going to use necessarily, and I also don't know what their interpretation of the document's going to be. So in some ways, for me, a Socratic seminar is content-free in that I'm not trying to push a particular interpretation. On the other hand, I very much want kids to practice using discussion moves and the language of discourse. I agree with you because of this, or a piece of text that supports my idea or interpretation is that, or it seems as though you're saying this, I'm saying this, I'm finding common ground in this particular idea. So I post sentence starters in my classroom, and we review some of the academic language and knowledge structures that I think are important. But I'm asking them to use them in an authentic way, which means if it fits, they use it. But if it doesn't fit, I'm not going to beat them over the head about it, because my Socratic seminars are an opportunity. It's a piece of time out of the curriculum where it really is about what do you as students have to say and think about this particular text, and that's where we're going to go with it. So that, again, and I keep using this word tension because they have to use that language to be able to articulate their ideas clearly, but I'm not explicitly trying to teach that in the context of the seminar, if that makes sense.
It does. I think a couple of ways that I would approach this. One is looking at what teachers have to do on a regular basis is create these, well, at least in the schools that I've worked at, is that teachers have to create these giant flashcards, which I call anchor charts, which are blanketing the room, which the kids may or may not be interacting with. And, I think these can be used in dynamic ways. But if the kids don't have thinking strategies to interact with those giant flashcards, then it's mainly just at a loss. It's a checklist that they're doing for someone to come and observe. And
well, I'll give you a great example. I was working with elementary teachers, and so I was working with this group of fourth grade teachers, and they had put up sort of like a word wall. They had put up a sentence starter wall, and they were working with the phrase "I agree with" or "I disagree with." So I come in to observe this seminar, and every single kid is starting with, I agree with Chris because of this. I agree with Chris, but disagree with Marlon because of that. And it's like, and so the task then became, how do we move them away from those sentence starters and to begin to express what they're thinking without having to what they perceive as jumping through those hoops. And so it's, how do you make this be real? How do you make it be authentic? In the modes of conversation where sometimes you say, I agree with someone, and sometimes you just agree with them.
Yeah, and not just sort of parroting back that thing that's going to make teacher happy. Because
that's on the wall, right?
Right, the terminology. Owen Lanihan, we had on the talk before, and he talked about the walls of classroom spaces. And, he has this method of creating three main walls in a classroom, and one is the presentation wall where the teacher would always present new material, and then embedded on that wall are thinking moves of how to interact with that material. and then the process wall, which would have more different set of thinking moves, which could be applied there. And so each of these spaces kind of had these thinking purposes. I thought that was kind of clever. I think any things could be destroyed and taken too far, but I think at the heart of this is this: you want this culture of Socratic thinking in your classroom, but you also need a common culture of talking. And so it's that dividing line between cult and culture. Like schools can be very cultish, like everyone's going to abide by this particular way of talking about this particular topic. And that can really be overbearing for me, where I just want people to express. And if we're using a different terminology, I think it's okay. We've talked a little bit about this idea of the curriculum being, a mile wide and 2 inches deep, or not so wide, but going much more deeper. And so deeper learning is a big content or big speaking piece in education now. I see the hashtag all over the place. So let's delve into that. And really what I wanted to get at was how much content goes into a Socratic circle. Because how much content, like the size of the text. So in her article, she talks about choosing a rich text offers cross content and real world connections. And she often uses a whole novel as the basis for a Socratic seminar. Right. This to me was a little bit threatening, because I was thinking like, well, I have seen talks where the kids were moving too fast to the text. They were just becoming, kind of jumpy conversations where everyone was ready. So they had their list of topics they wanted to cover, and they just were so ready to jump to the next topic without really going deep into it and getting textual analysis and questioning each other. And that space of going deep, how important do you think is the amount of content or the amount of concepts they're trying to get covered in the circle?
I think it's really important. And so, with all due respect, I am very explicit that you do a Socratic seminar perhaps on a chapter of a book, but not on the whole book, because the problem is that there's so much text and so many ideas, if it's young adult fiction or something, that there's just too much stuff there. And so you're asking the seminar to carry way much more weight than is possible. Whereas a chapter, chapters run 10, 12 pages. That's a lot of text to explore. So I think what you want is there's no set or optimum length of a text. The shortest text that I've used, but some of the most interesting seminars I've ever had have been on the Pledge of Allegiance, which is a dozen words, something like that, couple dozen words. And one of the comments that kids make in the critique is that the conversation was great, but the text was so short, it was hard to refer back to the text. They were referring, in that case, back to just words or phrases rather than sentences or bits of paragraphs. So my notion of a good Socratic seminar text is that it's a text that is manipulatable by the kids, and they can go almost anywhere in the text, and ideas can be connected, but kids can get there. So imagine with a novel, somebody's talking about an idea in the first chapter, and somebody else is in chapter 12. There's a whole span of stuff that's between that. So, short stories work particularly well as texts in literature or in social studies. A science experiment can work as something, or an op-ed piece in science. So I try and find something that's sufficiently rich that it's going to support a conversation. And again, part of this is related to how much time you have for the conversation. So in the school the last school where we worked, where seminars were particularly important, I did teach a course that every week we did a seminar on a full United States Supreme Court text. But we started with shorter Supreme Court cases, and we worked towards, sometimes they were longer, and we never got through the whole text. And part of the understanding in the agreement was that we would talk about the ideas that we talked about in that particular Supreme Court case that week, and we knew that there were lots of things we'd never touch on. But you got to let go of the fact that you're going to talk about what you're going to talk about, and you're not going to talk about the stuff that you didn't talk about. And you can't then beat the kids up or the class up for saying, but you didn't get to this idea, because there's lots of ideas. In the same way that you've limited our discussion on questions for your podcast because we could talk all night about any of them. We talk about what we talk about in the seminar, and we have to be good with that. So I try to make text not be too daunting for kids, so that they can all kind of manipulate their way through, and it's not sort of, we're not all over the place over a couple of hundred pages or 50 pages.
Yeah, I've heard it referred to as the conspiracy against learning. One of my former professors called it, Barbara Noel, is that teachers are often on these tracks moving so quickly that they don't allow this depth to happen. And right. I think what you're referring to also is this this idea that you're not trying to teach the whole text. You're trying to a way of thinking that will be applied to the whole text, but that you may only take one section of it and go as deep as you can into that one section.
And I really want to reinforce that. When I'm doing a Socratic seminar, I'm not teaching the text. I'm teaching kids how to talk about a text, and that's the text we happen to be talking about. So the text gets taught as a byproduct, in a peripheral way, because I don't know what they're going to talk about with the text, but I want them to talk well and thoughtfully and rigorously and with certain sorts of behaviors. And it's the speaking about, it's the speaking, listening, oracy skills that I'm really reinforcing, and the thinking skills, it just happens to be about this text. But you really got to let go of the text to have the conversation about the text.
I can see how that could align very well with Common Core. Whether you agree what's on there or not, Common Core is very much about...
It totally aligns with it. Totally aligns with it. But...
And content is totally different. Whereas would roast us on that, saying it's all about creating the common content, so we have ways of speaking about the same stuff.
But the frustration and what drives teachers, where you really got to let go, is that you're not driving the agenda of what's going to be talked about in that given text. You just got you have to let go. It's like, you may think that this is a great theme to talk about. If the kids are talking about some other theme that's worth talking about, you're having a great conversation about that, and you have to let go of that other thing that you thought would be worth talking about. It's hard for teachers to let go of that stuff.
Let's talk about the why of and this, I think embedded in this also is the product of learning, that so much of school seems to get centered around this production of numerical grades, which we know is good in some ways because it gives us immediate measures, and that which is not measured is not going to improve, as some say. But at the same time, it's become this obsession about this is what we're producing. It's just a series of numerical grades. The prep work that goes into a Socratic circle seems to open up a different way of thinking about this. And I feel like we need to rebrand this, that yes, kids are always going to be working towards some kind of product in learning. They will probably get some kind of mark or measure, or whether it's the rubric or numeric measure or whatever. You discuss this ticketing system, and I think this kind of changes the why of kids are connecting to their work, that they know they're preparing for an event. And if you're preparing for an event, that which you're learning is that much more bonding, you're that much closer to it, because you know you're going to have applicability of that knowledge immediately after. Is this kind of what you're trying to get at? Are you trying to rewrite how we brand what's important in education? What are your thoughts on this? You don't have to go. You don't have to answer this one if you don't want to, because
no. I think it's interesting. There's a bunch of stuff that's on the table. Tickets. So I said that most of my career was in high school, and it was in a community where kids were expected to do homework. Schools that had expectations that kids would do homework. So my very first Socratic seminar, I always do the text in class, so I know that everybody's read the text or had access to the text, because I want to sort of get them interested in the idea of having a seminar, and I hope it goes well. The second one the text I assign as a homework reading with a ticket. And the ticket really began as just an expedient. It's sort of like, how do I know if you're in the circle or out of the circle? Because what's, for me, unique about a Socratic seminar is that we know, as best we can, that everybody's read the text. I mean, everybody has participated in conversations, in discussions in classrooms without having ever read the homework. What makes a Socratic seminar different is that because it's text-bound, kids are making references back to the text, you can't participate in it. It's not fair to the group. It's not fair to you if you haven't read the text, because you can't refer to the text, right? So there's a difference between seminar conversations and bullshitting, right? We all know how to bullshit because you don't have to refer to the text. Seminars, you have to refer to the text. So I just needed some quick and dirty way to know if you're in the the seminar or you're not. If you got the ticket, I decided you were in. If you didn't have the ticket, you were out. But I tried to make the ticket be something that was more interesting to do than a lot of normal sort of homeworky assignments. So with a short story, it was drawing a map of the scene of the short story, or a blueprint of the building in which the events took place, or something along those lines. There's a short story I use called How Wang Fo Was Saved, and the ticket list all of the colors that are mentioned in this. So yes, kids do the ticket, and I had a better return rate of tickets as homework than lots of other homework, because kids knew that if they did the ticket, they could participate in the conversation. If they didn't do the ticket, they'd be observers, and kids don't like to be told that they can't participate. It also gave me a little bit of accountability for a grade book, and I'm not the world's greatest grade person, but you got to have some things in there. But the ticket's utility was used up when I said, do you have it, do you not have it? Because I've never actually explicitly felt an obligation to refer to the ticket in the seminar conversation. If it comes up, that's fine, but it's not like my job in the seminar is to validate the ticket. So there's that. So in some ways, it's rebranding it, because it's like, I'm doing this so I can be a part of a conversation, as opposed to I'm doing this so I can get a mark in a grade book.
No, and comparing this to reading circles, where in reading circles, you're going to have a very dispersed, jigsawed environment where, each kid has a different job, and they're all going to come back to the circle with this artifact that they're going to present to the group. And that's going to be the speaking point of the discussion. So I see a little overlap there. I've also been reading, or for the second time reading, Ron Berger's An Ethic of Excellence, where very adamant about this product of learning, and that when kids produce these iterated prototype products and get constant feedback, and these critique cycles they go through, that the presentation of the product is a presentation of all of the prototypes. So this was my first draft, this is my second draft, these are all of the ways I receive feedback, and here's my final product. That this speaks so much louder, and watching kids talk off of their learning products, is just amazing. And there's no question about their attachment to that learning. We've mentioned before, I think with you as well, this aesthetic, effective, ethical connection to learning. And this comes into kind of a question I want to ask you as well about physical form. It seems very simple about the form of the circle, but if you are presenting artifacts, are you pretty adamant about it being a democratized round space? Or do you see advantage of seeing a semicircle, half circle, centered around either a screen or product observation area, where kids could project up their product, and that gives everybody sort of a common focal point of talking about things?
So a Socratic seminar for me would never be students presenting work. Socratic seminar for me would always be a conversation about a text we share in common. Doesn't mean that pedagogically I wouldn't provide opportunities for kids to present work and for us to comment and discuss that and to have conversation. But for me, a Socratic seminar always is about a specific piece of work, a text, that might have been selected by students. A student may have selected the text, and so it's always in a circle because it's a conversation about this particular text. Could be a poem, could be a film, could be a ropes course. It could be any one of a variety of different sorts of texts, but that text is always the thing around which and towards which we are discussing and trying to draw meanings and interpretations. So that circle is important because we should all have an equitable voice. And in a Socratic seminar, for me, every student has a name tent because partly it makes it easier to conduct the seminar. Partly I think that when you're speaking and your name, Chris, is in front of you, it's easier to associate an idea with you in the conversation. I think there's a little bit more accountability that it's Chris's idea, and I find the kids are better at saying, well, Chris, you had said this, but John, you said that, because they've got these visual cues. So yeah, the space is a circle. And it's not a presentation, it's a conversation. Now, to the revision process, I will say that so I use seminars for the thinking and conversation skills. I also happen to use the seminars as a vehicle for my writing in the content area. So I always followed up a Socratic seminar with an expository essay assignment of some sort and the question that they would answer, and I gave them choice, usually grew out of the seminar conversation. So it gave them an opportunity to go back and think more and to write. But the school also, and I think it was one of the biggest changes that I made as a teacher, was really creating this culture of revision, that students never learn how to write high quality essays unless they revise to the point where they've written a high quality essay. A kid who writes a C essay and always gets a C on their essays never knows what a B or an A essay looks like. But if they revise that C essay until it really is a work of excellence, then they've gone through the process and they can more likely draft a better essay and a better essay and a better essay. And so seminars were a way to work towards that notion of excellence too, through a culture of revision.
No, really interesting. I feel like you're crossing into this Ron Berger book, exactly what he talks about of this. I can see the Socratic process that you go through in a circle, but then I can see how that would easily transfer into the critique cycle of bringing your product, your writing essay, your draft, whatever, and bringing it before your peers and your teacher, and having the same kind of discussion. To me, what you have is this focus on the social construction of knowledge, this rapid fire discussion applied to everything. I've tried mixing. I have put Artifact up, and as we did these symposiums in junior grade books, I would throw up photographs of segments of student text, things they had written on the way there. And it's funny, listening to you, I realized I was never very successful at that our most successful circles were when we focused on the talking part. That when I would go and try to mix it up and make it fancy with some of these other elements, which are, I think, totally cool pedagogical elements to put, like, we're going to put this kid's work up on the board. Right. We're going to make that the mini lesson for the day. Right. This is our writing lesson. But, retrospectively, I'm thinking when we just focus on the talking part, it seemed to go a lot more successful, and kids seemed to get what it was about a little bit more.
But and I think that one of the things that I've been a teacher for a really, really long time. I like to joke that I began teaching in the previous millennia. And sort of over the arc of my career, and it was always, teachers never had enough time to do whatever they were going to teach. Nobody got up to 1975 when I started teaching in 1975. Nobody gets up to 2016. In 2016, there's too much to teach. But I think there's increased pressures because of a lot of the assessment stuff that's going on and just the changes in our cultures and societies. And so, but I think one of the problems has been that we ask teaching activities to do more than they should be asked to do. It's like, a seminar is a seminar. Let's just have a conversation. Let's not try to figure out how to turn it into a vocabulary lesson and a writing lesson and these things. And I think that if we can sort of when we're doing student critiques and we're doing a mini teach and we want to put up 3 different examples of student writing, let's just ask that activity to carry that water. Let's ask seminars to carry the water that they can carry, but let's not try to always kind of, I think with good intent, we try to do as much as we possibly can. But sometimes we got to sort of say, this is what this strategy does, and this is what that strategy does. Let's do each of them with the greatest sense of integrity that we can.
No, and I hear you. I see it as sort of one of the building blocks in this toolkit of creating this dispersed knowledge environment where kids are able to, and I definitely hear you on the tweaks. Like I'm very techie, and so I loved the video recording of the Socratic sessions. Like that to me was amazing. It made the kids feel this kind of validation and importance, and especially when we'd go back and pull clips out of there and discuss what kind of thinking that was going on, while they were doing this. So, I mean, I would actually pull only the best moments, like, third grader goes on for 4 minutes or whatever excruciating amount of time on their ideas. But if you take the best 30 seconds of that kid's going to look like they're just, an academic in college at a seminar class or something. So, I mean, those were sort of my strategies of playing around with it. Let's talk about this idea of developing Socratic culture. And so this, again, comes from this idea, from the same article, and she says that I practice gradual release of the Socratic Seminar throughout the year. And I know we touched on this before, but I kind of like to probe a little deeper. Early on, I insert myself into the conversation frequently, and these interruptions can be feedback about strong performances, ways to improve, lessons about conversation strategies, muting dominant voices, soliciting reserved voices, basically choreographing the whole discussion. We mentioned this before, and I've talked about the arc of my involvement of in the beginning of the junior breakout sessions, kind of having to prompt and having to jump in and help kids add on or stop and remind them to go look for textual references and then get them to reflect on those references. I felt very involved, and I felt like the manager of the circle, whereas by the end, in some of the best ones, I would start simply by introducing it, and the kids would go off for 15, sometimes even more. I mean, I kind of capped them at 12, but if the discussion was good, I let them take it as far as 20. And they totally knew it. Like they were just so involved in the discussion that when 6th, 3rd graders can sit around for 20 minutes and could have gone on even further and having the best time
Pretty cool.
with that material in the book, it's absolutely amazing.
Cool.
What would you suggest as far as measuring your own involvement? I know that we as teachers, we dominate the airways. It's a reflex that I'm guilty of too, that our voices, our whims, our fancies are so often what's going out there. Sometimes interrupting kids in the middle of thought, sometimes interrupting their discussions. And part of this Socratic circle, I feel like, is the forced physical removal of the teacher out of the circle. My question is more about like how to initiate it and keep it going, whereas the kids may not enter the first time with the skill set of managing a discussion for that long.
I think that you're totally right about the role of teachers and how much we dominate the airways. And, again, one of the notions is that, this seminar is this time when it's going to be a little bit more authentic and a little bit different than what kids are used to. So I agree. I think earlier seminars, every seminar, I have to play traffic cop in some way, shape, or form. And early seminars in the school year, I play more traffic cop because not all kids are acculturated to the norms of a Socratic seminar. And so it's saying, just a second. And, sort of, or seeing some kid leaning forward and helping them get into the circle. But most of my role is, I have two roles. One of them is just traffic cop behavior management sorts of stuff. And that's, or you don't have to raise your hands, or you're interrupting, those sorts of things, and trying to at least keep it as civil a place as possible as kids are learning the skills, because they don't come to that automatically. The second is that I'm trying to help them move their ideas forward. So it's like being an intellectual traffic cop. But remember John Roberts in his confirmation hearing, talking about Supreme Court justices, said that what you're supposed to be is the referee. You're supposed to call the balls and strikes. And I think my role is I think intellectually is trying to just make sure that they're playing fair with each other. And you said this idea and you said that idea. Which of those does the text really support better? I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with either of them. Or everybody seems to be supporting this notion. Let's try on the other, another interpretation, but it's not trying to signal the right or the wrong interpretation. And in my workshops, one of the things that startles teachers is how valuable wait time is. Just shutting up and letting ideas percolate. If you're asking interesting questions, there should be some wait time. Kids should be thinking. Even the hunters should be thinking about what you've asked. Kids often will ask for your interpretation or want to know more content, and you sort of just have to say to yourself, I'm not going to use this as an opportunity to teach kids, though I could. And so I think that the role of the teacher is always there as sort of an intellectual referee, a behavioral referee, trying to keep it going. But I've never absented myself from a conversation, though I agree with you that as kids get better at doing this, I have to do less work as the seminar leader. But I think partly, and I think I may have said this the last time around, I kind of believe that they pay us the big money to sit in the circle and help them have the best conversation they can even though they could have a good conversation with me sitting on the outside of the circle at some point?
Yeah, and that I was just on a Twitter chat a couple of nights ago, and this idea of the wait time, which is a really hard thing to explain to people. I've mentioned this several times, but the first times I started this idea of the inquiry or the student-created inquiry in junior grade books, you read a story to them, and usually a story quite above a lot of their levels, but it's full of engaging, concepts that any kid's going to get into.
Right.
And I would just, no discussion, kids go to their desk and they have to sit silently, and I would put a timer on for 10 minutes, which for a third grader is
forever. It's an eternity.
And for
most teachers, it's an eternity.
Yeah. And just silence in the classroom that long. It's like if anyone walked in, the first response would be, what happened? Like, what went wrong? So the first 2 minutes are just excruciating, because I'm thinking as a teacher, I can't believe I'm putting them in. I've given them a task that's so far above their level. How awful I am as an adult to do this to kids. And then all of a sudden, after 2 minutes, the pencils start moving. And then someone starts writing over here. And then pretty soon, this person sees them writing. So he starts getting ideas. And 5 minutes in, everyone is just scribbling away. And so by the end of 10 minutes, we have the richest set of inquiry that we can then make affinity groups with, or divide into quick answer questions that are right there in the text, or deeper thought questions, or masaya questions. So that wait time always pays back. I've never had an inquiry session that didn't really work like that. And I know the See, Think, Wonder routine of Project Zero is excellent for that, because it requires students to stop and look for 2 minutes at something, and just notice as many. And as soon as you start quieting your other perceptions, all of a sudden you can really focus on these other tasks at hand, and picking out these other details or thoughts that are in the recesses of your mind. I think putting kids in that space is a really important part of developing this kind of critical thinking. So let's talk about.
Also, what I think relates to this too is, I really work with teachers in Socratic Seminars, sort of in the formal setting of a Socratic Seminar, though I think it also migrates into other parts of their classroom practice, to sort of be aware of their bobblehead and their involuntary, great idea, that's really interesting. Because what I want is, I don't want the teacher to be saying this is really interesting. I want other kids to be saying that this is interesting. And there are kids, and when you teach third graders, they haven't quite got it, but by the time they're in fifth grade, they do. They're watching for all of the cues as to what might be the right interpretation, what might be the right answer. And until you really build this Socratic culture where kids realize that their interpretations have value and they're not doing the work to get my answers, you really got to watch your bobblehead, and you really got to watch those God, that's really interesting. It's like, I don't know if it's interesting. Maybe other kids think it's stupid. But we really want to have kids not be performing for us and looking for us for affirmations, but rather seen in the marketplace of ideas in this conversation, this egalitarian setting that we talked about earlier. What ideas float, which ideas don't float. But it's not up to the teacher to decide which ones do and which ones don't, or to give their the imprimatur that this is or isn't a good idea.
Do you find yourself playing the role of Paulo Freire, of looking for that critical discussion whenever kids disagree, and really meeting out the different viewpoints? Is that something you try to exploit within the circle? Or
well, one of the things that I've modeled this from the person I learned how to do seminars with, is that the best skill that you can use as a seminar leader is to listen, and to really listen. And one of the things that I listen for is when one line of reasoning is going this direction and another line of reasoning is sort of going that direction, and it's saying, so let's go back to the text and see in what ways the text supports either of these lines of reasoning. And so it's not, I don't want to debate. I want to get deeper, and I want to hear, so I'm hearing this and I'm hearing that. Do we think it's more this, or do we think it's more that? And what text supports the this or the that? And so, yeah, I do listen for those junctures. And I think kids are looking for those junctures where you're really getting at the nexus of something. And in any good text, there ought to be lots of thises or that's.
And you've mentioned this separation, like really important to separate the idea from the person. That if the person is so attached to the idea, it kind of defeats the purpose of this collective intelligence construction of something. That I'm going to throw this idea out there, but it doesn't have to be my idea anymore. It's just an idea I've thrown out there, and anyone else can tweak it or twist it or add to it and do other things with it.
Yeah.
is that something just naturally happens that we sit back as teachers, pedagogically and think, oh, it's so amazing? Or do you have kind of ways to get kids to think about that separation of the idea from the person?
Well, one of the norms that comes out, and we develop our seminar norms sort of collaboratively after having done a seminar, is first of all to learn how to disagree agreeably. I don't agree with this idea. Doesn't mean I don't like you. It doesn't mean I don't, that I think you're stupid. I just happen to hold a different notion, number one. And number two, a lot of it is my role as the leader is sponsoring an idea. I heard Chris say this. Let's find some text that supports it. And I remember, again, going back to the Supreme Court cases thing, that class of 21 kids, 20 kids thought in one direction, one kid thought in a different direction. And so my move as the leader was to say, so just a second, let's just spend a little bit of time taking Kyle's perspective seriously. Let's all take some time finding text that supports Kyle's perspective. I don't know whether he's right or he's wrong, but something in the text must be moving him to this interpretation. Let's see if we can work on understanding where the text supports Kyle's work. And that's just, if you want any better example of how poorly we do as a society at understanding different perspectives, look at the current presidential contest. The inability to understand or to accept even the validity of a different perspective is really what's paralyzing us. And so those, again, are the civic skills that I want kids to learn, is how do you take somebody else's idea seriously? You don't have to agree with it, but how do you take it seriously and then come to some understanding from that?
Yeah, this is in one of the, I'm looking for here's the questions from it, but a great article just about like critical thinking in the era of spin. And what I feel like got covered in this is one of the greatest justifications for developing a Socratic culture in your classroom, but at the same time realizing that there are epistemological assumptions that come with that. So I'm going to hit you up with some statements and just reflex answer, take them wherever you want. But I think what this is getting at is that this isn't just a, getting kids, like having that bigger picture of why we want them to think critically is having the life skills that when they get out of school, they have rehearsed all of this kind of thinking that can be applied all over the place. And I agree. What's happening in Colombia with the no vote on the process, and what's happening with our presidential debates. I watched it. It was quite painful. Mainly as a critical thinker. I just had a really hard time with it. So here, let's start with this one. Knowledge is socially constructed through critical dialogue. Now, there are educators who are not going to agree with that. What would be your sort of defense of that?
First of all, I would say yes. And secondly, I think that all of the evidence, I guess what I would say also is that it's not the only way that we come to knowledge. I just think if we live in a society, in a social environment, if we've got a governmental structure that depends upon social interaction and the meaning of making through our representative democratic structures, then you ought to at least have some experience in socially constructing knowledge. Again, it's not the only way to do it. Some of the greatest thinkers came up with their ideas not in social contexts, but we have to recognize that it is one of a very powerful means of coming to knowledge, number one. And number two, we happen to have organized our political structure around the social construction of civic understanding, civic policy. So we have to have some experience in doing that together and doing it in ways that are civil, civic, and thoughtful.
It's interesting because I struggle with this one a lot. I know that you can learn something without being social around it, but I also know that in what I would call some of my most intense learning environments, which were mainly introduced by going to a liberal arts school where you had classes with 8 people. And if you did not read and could defend your arguments, you were just going to feel horrible leaving that class. So with kids who are always in, especially the younger kids, I feel like they're always in this, the younger you go, the closer they are to not really knowing the difference between thought and speech. You talk to a first grader on the playground and they're half in stream of consciousness as they talk to you. Like whatever they think is kind of coming out of their mouth. And as they get older, they learn all the filters, and not only like, oh, what I think is very different from what I'm saying sometimes, and also fifth graders, for example, get to that stage where what I'm saying, they immediately see it reflected in their peers, where they become very socially conscious of the effects of these kinds of expression as well.
But I do think, to be fair to sort of the spectrum of teachers, I don't expect every teacher to be totally on the social construction of learning, but I also expect other teachers to not disrespect the social construction of learning. And I think that polarization has been the problem in our ed wars.
No, and to me, it kind of justifies school. Why would we go to this environment and cram ourselves in these rooms for 8-9 hours a day for extended periods of time? And the great advantage is the collaborative element. Now,
and that's one of the things that worries me about some of the online learning modalities, is to what extent are we losing the face-to-face real-time interactions that take place in classrooms? Doesn't mean that there can't be meaningful opportunities for conversation and things like that, but to what extent are we missing those face-to-face real-time ones?
Yeah, I mean, at the conference, that you saw the photos of everybody looking down at their tweets and their mobile devices, and they lose the entire mirror neuron networks that go through when you actually watch someone read aloud or someone speak.
That's right.
All of that meta language that is around the words themselves, our gestures, our eyes, our expression, our prosody, all those things are such important parts of that as well.
Sorry.
Let's try another one. Classrooms and schools are learning systems, and this has to do with treating the Socratic circle as no quick fix, but as an important element, a space to practice this Socratic culture with very specific rules. But what you're trying to get at is that learning is a system by working with these people over a period of time and developing these interpersonal relationships that are part of this construction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, but I think it goes to the first statement as well, is that the system, and again, it goes to something I said at the very beginning of our conversation, is that the system that you're trying to create is a thinking system, and that takes trust, and it takes respect, and it takes practice. And so Socratic seminars are one of the venues that those skills and dispositions are practiced in a formal setting. But one of the things I talk a lot to teachers in Socratic seminar workshops is that as you do more and more formal Socratic seminars, my experience is that you become more and more Socratic in your teaching, meaning you have greater trust that you can throw questions back to students, that students more naturally refer back to a text or to the problem or to what somebody said before, and that you create, again, sort of this virtuous cycle of where thinking becomes the dominant modality rather than just performing or doing low-level, knowledge recall sorts of tasks. And so I do think it's a system, and I think it's a system that wants to trend towards valuing thinking, and that thinking is really what's behind learning.
Yeah, in my own evolution as a teacher, I was trained in a very rigid success for all system designed by John Hopkins. And from what I gather, I'm no specialist on their system, but I do see in a couple different places this importance they place on volume. It's the volume of text you go through. It's the volume that you read. It's the volume that you write. And so I would design these reading and writing programs kind of centered around that. I could have kids burning through stories and producing pages of text off of those stories. But we weren't really focusing on going really deep into each question. Kids would write a half page on these questions and give textual evidence and give their own ideas, but I wasn't really getting into that, meeting out the different elements there and really focusing on this, multiple perspectives around a text. But then when I started teaching and alternating in between junior grade books and this other kind of system, it was really funny because the kids would come off of a junior grade book session and they would love it. And then we would go back into this other kind of just very rigid system. And we'd start a discussion and I could just feel their disappointment when the discussion would be just cut short. Like they wanted to go deeper, and I didn't, give them that space and time to do it.
Right.
Whereas I think if you look at sort of what I've been more exposed to, the TC reading and writing model and balanced literacy, there's such an emphasis on the small group where teachers interact mostly, except for the mini lesson and the read aloud, there's mostly small group meeting time, individual conferences, which leaves a lot of space for this Socratic thinking to appear in all of these different spaces.
So going back to another one of the tensions that exists is that on the one hand, the more Socratic you come, your experience with the junior grade books, kids become empowered to think that they actually have important things to say and that you're going to listen to those things. And that tension, that's in tension with a sort of product-based pedagogy that is really evident in lots and lots of classrooms, where it's like we're cranking stuff out. It's like, I don't want to crank stuff out. I want to actually think about things, and you've empowered me to do so. Why can't I do it here? And so that's a tension that exists in classrooms.
Embedded in that tension, we could spend hours just on the whole testing model, but I feel like this is a big part of it, is that you create this criteria for testing. This is the criteria of measurement. This is what people will game. Do you know what I mean? Like if we have to, if volume of reading and writing is what gets kids to delve into standardized testing and score well on it, well then of course administrators, teachers will gravitate towards that kind of teaching, this efficiency model.
And we end up with producers but not learners.
Yeah, and I think I had the luck of at least getting exposed to these different reading models, and definitely strayed from the course of just trying to get kids to produce kind of pages of text that never went through revision process or went through peer critique, never went really deeply into story discussions. But then when I started doing those things, standardized testing, without even paying attention to it, went off the Richter. Like my kids would score amazing on that stuff.
Because they actually are able to think.
Yeah, they get these questions out. Map test, which gives you the harder and harder question each time you answer, is another thing, because I didn't really teach them how to fail. Like when you get to a text that's so hard that you're not, you don't want to beat yourself up over it. Let me go into a couple more, because I know that. And
I've only got a couple more minutes.
Okay, so let's hit this one, because I think this is going back to this idea of the Trump election and the big picture of what we're preparing kids for. The world is full of illusions. Good tasting foods that have bad effects on the body, politicians that promise a better program than a predecessor, marketing that places products as part of a seemingly convincing narrative, information coming from friends, parents, internet, radio, films, TV, newspaper, magazines. Critical thinking could be the best defense of becoming a victim to these illusions.
Yes.
Okay, we're done. Great.
Yes. It's like, I'll give you one example. Then in Boulder, and there's going to be a local ballot initiative to impose a tax on sugary drinks, 5% tax at the wholesale level on sugary drinks, and they're doing it because they want kids to be more healthy. That's a way to deal with that behavior. Obviously, thinking about weight, eating, exercise. I drink a Coke every now and again when I'm on a bicycle ride or when I feel, but it's not. I think about it. It's an intentional choice, and everything that you listed there is you can have intention around things, or you can just be reactive. And I think what we're trying to do is create classrooms where thinking is intentional, which means behavior becomes more intentional, or at least you get to think about when you make unintentional sorts of decisions. And so what we want is not legislation to try and I'll probably vote for it because what the hey, but what we really want is not to have to vote on sugary drinks. We want people thinking about what's the consequence of drinking all this, or my weight, or what's my relationship to exercise and those things. That's what we want.
Great. John, thank you very much for joining. I know we could go on a lot of these topics.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And they're really thoughtful questions. I really appreciate the thinking that went into them and stuff. And it's just pushes me to think more too. So I really appreciate that.
Well, if we talk again, we'd love to have you back on the podcast, but it would be great to go into more scenarios of looking at what it looks and feels like inside of a Socratic circle, kind of picking apart why this really is the 21st century learning skills, Common Core, the ISTE student standards, the new literacies. It appears in all of these places.
Right.
And I kind of like your defense of saying that this is a space to practice these particular set of skills. Don't start fusing it into all the other things. I've heard the same argument with our podcast on Theater of the Oppressed mentioned the same thing. Like, well, if you're only going to take components of this and put other places, then call that something different, or call that part of your participatory culture of the classroom. But preserve this as its own set of activities in space. Great. Hopefully you can stick around just for a minute afterwards.
I can't. I'll let you hang things up, and I'm here.
Okay, great.